Good afternoon and welcome to Live with ASI. I'm MK Smith.
And I'm Bassam Haddad. And here is Live with ASI, which you already said. That's right. No. Do it again.
One more time.
That's one more.
Thank you for joining us today. As we have promised, today will be largely a discussion of Gaza and the various events and teach-ins that the Arab Studies Institute has been hosting with the hopes of further educating folks about what is going on in Gaza and what has been going on since 1948. We are joining you today with the current death toll in Gaza of 11,261 people, 40 to 45% of whom are children. And also, of course, at this moment, Israeli occupation forces are surrounding Al-Quds Hospital in Gaza. So, of course, we all have our eyes on that as well right now.
And we have been very fortunate to be able to bring together a large number of university research centers and other research centers to create perhaps one of the largest collaborations on knowledge production on Gaza and Palestine. And the list of universities is available, as well as the teach-ins and as well as the podcasts, as well as the resources that we're gradually adding, including a very comprehensive but categorized list of statements on Gaza. You can find everything at palestineincontext.org, which we will have always on the screen throughout this production.
Great. Okay, so we're going to start today's show. Before we dive into any particular topic as it pertains to Gaza, we're going to bring on frequent LWA guest and expert on Palestine, as well as media relations and media discussion of Palestine, Moon Rabbani, who will join us now.
And we will also bring in at the same time Professor Fida Adli, who is the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, who is also on the steering committee of the Gaza and Context project. And we will have a conversation together. Let me bring everybody in right now. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Hi, Professor. Hi, Moeen.
Hi, Fida.
Hi, Moeen. Hi, Bassam. Hi, MK.
Hi, Fida. Thank you for joining us. I know you are on the move, but you are remarkable for still joining us. So we will try not to keep you very long. And even though we were going to speak with Moeen early on about the various updates, perhaps we could start with talking a little bit about the project, and then we go to you, Moeen. Is that okay?
That's just fine.
All right. Fida, we are, of course, in a situation where a month after, we have produced quite a bit of work after that particular meeting that you and I and Ziad and Rochelle had right after October 7th to address what is going on, given the sort of misinformation and very problematic both discourse and action that had been taking place at the time. So can you just say a little bit about the project and how it has been developing?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Bassam. I mean, I think it's pretty remarkable how quickly we were able to pull this together, and that's really a testament to you, Bassam, and to ASI and Jadaliyya. And I'm hearing from many folks that these weekly teach-ins have been critical. We're profiling them on our website at Georgetown. I'm sharing them with folks in kind of like very specific ways. I think the most recent one on the kind of differences between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is really critical right now, particularly in North America and Europe, particularly given the kinds of the things that we're hearing from the ADL and the Brandeis Center, the statement that they've sent to university presidents about student activism, especially SJP on campuses, and trying to equate and actually making the assertion that SJP is providing a very dangerous assertion that SJP is providing material support to Hamas. And so I think that's just an example of just, how timely and critical these interventions are. And I know we're thinking about the next one being around know your rights. So it's a balance, right, between a focus on Gaza and what's happening on the ground there and contextualizing it, as well as what's happening in the West Bank, but also trying to fight this fight to try to suppress any kind of pro-Palestinian or any critique of Israel. And so these interventions are really critical right now. And I'll just say that I was at the Middle East Studies Association meeting last week, and we had breakout groups to talk about a range of issues, and freedom of speech and academic freedom is one. It's just sort of horrendous, the conditions at universities in the US and the UK, the US and Europe. And again, I think this last teach-in was critical in that respect. And the fact that we've been able to bring together so many of our institutions to collaborate on this is really valuable. And I hope we can mobilize that coordinated effort around some of these issues that we're facing in our institutions in the US. I'm happy to answer any other questions or comment on anything else, but those are just some initial thoughts.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Daly. This definitely helps us understand the intention behind the project as well as the future and what it might look like. As you mentioned, we want to reiterate to the audience that this is meant to be an ongoing project and one that continues to be educational for those who already do feel grounded in what's happening in Gaza and the history of Palestine, but also those who might be new to the discussion and who are doing their best to educate themselves and better understand what's happening. So thank you so much for joining us. We know that you are on the move, as Bassam said, so we appreciate you taking the time, and we do hope to have you back in the near future as things continue to unfold.
Thank you very much again, Fida. And we are just featuring here the project website titled Palestine in Context, and it actually includes the last teach-in we held yesterday, Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism, which featured Adam Horowitz, Shireen Say-Ali, John Reynolds, and Sheila Robinson, who discussed within about 50 minutes of presentations in succession their views on the topic, and then we opened it up for questions, where we also addressed matters related to the major accusations and weaponization of anti-Semitism, including the infamous phrase "from the river to the sea," as well as various other tropes that have been used to silence any kind of discussion, let alone criticism, of what has been happening in Gaza and Israel's assault after October 7th. We actually also have been producing a podcast titled The War on Palestine. It is produced twice a week by Noor Ariqat, Ziad Abu Rish, and myself, with a team of researchers who are trying to pare down the various aspects of the current war on Palestine and on Gaza in ways that is digestible. And it's about 15 to 20 minutes of very carefully curated summaries of the diplomatic track, the battleground, the humanitarian track, the geostrategic track, as well as the legal track. So I invite you to take a look at this website, where you will find all of the material and all of the teach-ins successively. Our next teach-in is actually scheduled for next Tuesday, and it will be with Abahir Al-Saqqa from Palestine, addressing the social history of Gaza, and it will be at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time and 7:30 p.m. Palestine time, unless there's funny business regarding the time zones, because we've had that in October already. So we thank you again, Fida, and we hope to continue working with you going
My pleasure.
forward.
Thank you.
Salam.
My pleasure. Take care.
Take care, Azizti.
Now, Marine, thank you for joining us. It is good to see you.
Pleasure to be here.
We have obviously a lot to discuss with you today. I want to start with your assessment of the media landscape, especially we'll start with the Western media landscape, if you don't mind. I have been hearing some discourse in which people are saying the narrative is changing. On CNN, there was the interview of the nurse who'd been operating out of Gaza and was really speaking her truth in her piece about Gazans in particular and Palestinians. That was probably to the chagrin of Anderson Cooper, if we're being honest. However, I'm curious if you think that if there really is a tangible change, because on the other hand, we've seen instances in which folks like our co-editor at Jadaliyya, Noor Erkat, go on BBC and basically be berated by an IDF spokesperson who's basically on air. So I'm curious your take on the current landscape.
Well, my sense is it's never been the case that Palestinian or pro-Palestinian voices are categorically and uniformly excluded from Western media. Often, you will find the opinion piece here or there, the studio guest here or there, but the general tenor is the Israeli narrative. So if you look, for example, at coverage in newspapers like the New York Times in the US, The Guardian in the United Kingdom, or the main television networks, it's, I think, a pretty uniform picture, which is that history began on October 7th. Israel is engaged in a war of self defense against terrorists whose main description is that they have acted as kind of an extension of the Nazi Holocaust and of ISIS. And Israel is doing its very best to minimize civilian casualties. And where it fails, this is first and foremost, if not exclusively, the responsibility of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Distinctions of emphasis here or there, but I think it would be fair to say that this is the general tenor of Western news coverage of the crisis of the past month.
Thank you for that. I'm curious if you can give our viewers a few resources on where they might focus their attention media-wise, other than perhaps simply Al Jazeera.
Well, I think Al Jazeera English has been providing very useful coverage. Another resource that some of our viewers may be familiar with is, of course, Jadaliyya, and specifically the podcasts and resources that were just discussed with FIDA. And then, I mean, even in mainstream Western news outlets that are much more easily accessible to most people, there are instances of valuable information. You mentioned the long interview that CNN conducted with this U.S. nurse who had been in the Gaza Strip. You can find valuable opinion pieces in mainstream newspapers. But generally speaking, if you look around long and hard enough, you will find credible and valuable information. Specifically in the US, I think an organization like Foundation for Middle East Peace or Mondovice produce regular and very focused and very credible reporting and information and analysis. And speaking of the Foundation of Middle East Peace, my podcast Connections has been off air for most of the past 6 weeks. First, I was traveling, and then I was preoccupied with writing and commenting about the Israeli war on the Gaza Strip. But this week, I will be hosting Lara Friedman, the executive director of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, to talk on the subject of silencing Palestine, specifically in the US. Next week, I will host our colleague Adil Iskandar to talk specifically about the media aspects of this conflict. And the week after, I will be speaking with Nathan Thrall about his new book, A Day in the Life of Abd Salama, and placing the themes it raises in the context of what's been happening this past month.
Great, thank you. Now, can I ask one more question? Am I permitted?
Sure. Are you permitted? Let me check with the Politburo.
Just one last quick question for you, Moon. I'm wondering if you can give us your reflections, perhaps on, I think one of the noticeable changes right now between the Nakba of 2023 versus 1948 is that we're witnessing the genocide on our phones, right? So we are seeing journalists like Motaz Aziz, based out of Gaza, showing us what's happening in real time. If you could just lend us your reflections on the importance of these journalists and the work they're doing.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that what we're seeing on our television screens now is not an anomaly. This has always been the Israeli way of war. If we go back and look at previous Israeli assaults on the Gaza Strip, if we look at Israeli conduct during the first and second intifadas, if we look at Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, even the wars of 56 and 67, where there were not only massacres of civilians, but mass summary executions, for example, of Egyptian prisoners of war. Israel has always done two things. It has refused to make any distinction between combatants and unarmed civilians, and it has always targeted civilian populations for political purposes in order to exercise pressure on their political leaders, which, as I understand it, is the dictionary definition of terrorism. But of course, again, returning to your previous question, another notable characteristic of the media coverage is once again this selective outrage. We express shock and horror and disgust and all the rest of it against one participant for its actions against one group of people, while taking a very coolly analytical approach to thousands of dead children when they're Palestinian. And I think the best example of this, of course, is National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, who has been this, tough as nails he-man every day on our television screens, dismissing ceasefires, telling us, war is hell, civilians get killed in armed conflict, get over it. But on the 7th of October, when he found out that Israelis were being killed too, he literally burst into tears like an infant on our television screens. And he, I think, is a very personification of the double standards, of the selective outrage that we have seen in so much of the West during the past month.
Thank you, Moeen. At this point, if you can stay with us, because we feel safe when you're around. No, if you can stay with us
I feel
for that
safe
purpose
with you.
throughout, because we will have other questions, and we would like you to also be able to address our guests. And we have two remarkable guests right now on hold, Ilana Feldman and Bshara Domani, who have masterfully addressed the question of the history of Gaza under the title Gaza and History, which was our second teaching. So I will bring them in right now and we'll have a conversation with them, starting with their take on what they feel people should take from the discussion.
And while Bassam brings our guests in, I will plug this particular teach-in and say, if you are unfamiliar with Gaza in any capacity, this is an excellent place to start in terms of this teach-in. It will ground your understanding of what is happening.
Absolutely. Ahlan wa sahlan. Bshara, hi. Ilana, how are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. We are grateful that you are joining us at this time. I mean, everyone is glued to the television and to various readings and writings on the topic, but we appreciate you coming in, and we'd love to get your take on the actual teaching and what you feel should be the takeaways for people who are beginning to learn and understand what is going on in Gaza. And we can let's start with Bshara, and then we go to Ilana, and then perhaps we can have a conversation if you have time.
Sure. Very briefly, I think it's very helpful to look at Gaza as a pure product of 1948 on several levels. One, it's majority, overwhelmingly refugee population. They experience massacres, ethnic cleansing, and incarceration, which are a global kind of phenomena going back to the 16th century of settler colonialism. But they have experienced it in a kind of a pure way. They're the only place where you have overwhelmingly majority refugee population, still large and many refugee camps. And they are also unusual because they're recent in time, unlike previous historical precedents. So, in terms of scale and time and demography, it's a pure product of 1948. Now, Gaza is exactly the opposite now of what used to be historically an open place where goods and people flowed. Now it's a shadow of its former self as an economic region and more as a stateless geography, which is the second sort of distinctive feature. Not only are the people in it stateless, the geography itself is stateless, somewhat unique also globally in the sense that it's the only part of historic Palestine that was not annexed, like the West Bank and East Jerusalem, to Jordan or made part of Israel. It was under Egyptian rule, but not part of Egypt. And as a result, this combination has always spelled trouble for Israel and nearby Arab regimes because they always felt that a place with so many refugees in such a small space is going to be an incubator for persistent anti-colonial struggle, and surely it was. So the Gaza Strip has been an incubator in many ways of Palestinian movements from Fatah to Hamas. And it's also been a place where we see transformative events take place from the first Intifada to the second Intifada to the March of return to October 7th, many different ways of exploding kind of out of this prison. And then also, finally, that Gaza is a canary in the mine for a lot of the global challenges we are facing. So the story of Gaza is really a story of the globe. When we think about climate change, when we think about statelessness, about refugees, about equality and justice, about colonialism, etc., Gaza, what happens in Gaza reverberates across the globe. And that is why we see, I think, such a massive popular turnout in the streets from Latin America to Europe to the United States and elsewhere in support of the people of Gaza.
Thank you, Bshara. Let's turn to Ilana, who actually also, of course, was part of this very informative podcast. And if you can share with us, Ilana, some of the takeaways before we might pose a couple of questions. And Mu'in, I also invite you to join us.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll step a little bit back from some of the very crucial points that Bashara just mentioned about the specific history of Gaza and what it teaches us about Palestine, what it teaches us about colonialism, what it teaches us about global phenomena. To say a little bit about why I think it's so important to think about Gaza in history, as the title of our session was. I think and this maybe connects a little bit to some of what Moeen was saying before about some of the media coverage and the kind of presentism of media coverage of anything that happens in Palestine or elsewhere. But it's really impossible to understand what's going on without having a sense of the historical processes and dynamics, both that led to the current moment or any given current moment, but that are also embedded in processes that we see ongoing. And I think it's also just crucially important for us not only to, place some Gaza in history in its Palestinian historical context to understand the present, but also in order to understand that Gaza is a place, a full place where people live with a variety of social and cultural dynamics. We often, because of the intensity of the repeated crises that Gaza has faced, it can be very easy to think about it for those people who are sympathetic to Palestinians in Gaza as a place of solely victimhood, and for those people who are unsympathetic to think of it as a place of terror or terrorists, and recognizing the historicity of places that seem exceptional because of the suffering that they repeatedly undergo. I think it's crucially important for us to be able to envision futures that are beyond, even as crucial as it is to insist upon a ceasing of the attacks on civilians and the delivery of humanitarian aid. Those are not adequate to imagine a future for people. And only by recognizing Gaza and other places as full places can we begin to think more broadly.
Thank you, Ilana. Mu'in, if we can be in conversation with our guests, we promised them that we will not keep them very long, but if you have any comments or
Yeah,
questions.
I would just briefly add that not only has Gaza since 1948 played a kind of pioneering role in various developments in the Palestinian resistance to Israel, the Palestinian national movement, but conversely, it has also served as a human laboratory for Israeli methods of pacification and repression. We had the, I believe, 6 month occupation of Gaza, 1956, 1957, in the context of the Suez Crisis. We had the very intensive pacification campaign between 1968 and 1972. You fast forward to the First Intifada, and many of the most brutal methods that Israel deployed were first tested, if you will, in the Gaza Strip, which was also the case often during the Second Intifada, and now kind of many of these surveillance technologies that Israel has developed and is marketing globally were, at least until October 7th, often marketed as successfully tested in the Gaza in the Gaza Strip, and I think we're also seeing it now live of in terms of what is the most intensive bombardment in the history of the Middle East. And I think it's important. We're not talking about Scandinavia here. We're talking about a very conflict-ridden region over the past century, and nevertheless, we're still seeing the most intensive bombardment in the history of this region. So it's also, I think, very much a human laboratory for repression, for pacification, for surveillance, and so on.
Thank you, Ilana and Bshara. If you have any additional comments, especially that when we actually held the second teach-in, that was like literally, it sounds like it was ages ago. Are there any updates or anything that you'd like to share based on what has transpired?
One issue we haven't covered is the obsession of the Israeli government with the ethnic cleansing of the people in the Gaza Strip since the 1960s.
50s, actually.
Thank you, Moyen. You're right, since the 1950s. I don't want to get into the specific plans, but there's been many iterations and public discussion thereof. All these years, including some secret agreements with Latin American countries to move people from Gaza there in the 60s, which actually relocated about 15,000 Gazans. And 1 out of every 10 Gazans was forcibly ousted during the 67 war. There's been many plans since then. And of course, the first Kissinger-like trip by Blinken to the region right after October 7 discussed this issue of resettlement of the people of Gaza directly and openly with the Arab leaders, eliciting a kind of an angry response from Egypt and Jordan, who see this as undermining the survivability of the regime. So there is a structural aspect to all of this that cannot be forgotten, which is that the people of Gaza themselves are the enemy as far as Israel is concerned, not this group or that group. They see this concentration of people as a problem that must be solved, and I think they are trying very hard at this point, and we'll see the war of the hospitals as we see it right now taking place as the last sort of foothold of some people before the northern part of the Gaza Strip is completely ethnically cleansed. We see this as not a product of war on something else, but as the target of the war. Creating a humanitarian crisis and moving people out has been the real target all along. And that's why it's almost like flipping a switch. When the opportunity came, there was no hesitation. Within a few days, the US government was on board and was trying to sell the plan, a highly detailed plan, I should say, especially if you look at what Biden's language in asking the Congress for $106 billion. There's specific details there about moving people out, about 10 cities, et cetera, et cetera. And that was ready. So I think we have to keep a close eye on that. That could be something that would happen or may not happen. Only time will tell.
I have one final, very brief question for all three guests, if possible.
Want to ask Ilana if she wants? Okay.
Yes. And Elena, we'll have you take the last question first.
Lion's share.
Yeah, exactly. But I just want to make sure I ask it for a second, which in this conversation, there was a really powerful discussion that Elena actually brought up about categories and how categories are necessary to help us understand what's happening, but also can be quite damning and can box people into particular categories. For example, Palestinians in Gaza have been exclusively referred to as just Gazans, not Palestinians, or as refugees, or as terrorists, or what have you. I'm curious if the three of you, starting with Elena, might reflect on, in a future, rather than in a history, in which there is a liberated Palestine, what might the people of Gaza be? Are they Palestinians? Are they the free people of Palestine? It's a little pie in the sky, but I'd like your reflections.
Well, in some sense, that's not a question for me to answer. That's a question for Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinians everywhere to think about what are the frameworks in which the people understand each other. But I think it's important to remember that Palestinians in Gaza have always been Palestinian, despite this effort to separate in different ways the communities of Palestinians from each other. They have never been anything other than that, plus lots of other things. And there's nothing, I think the relationship to the multiplicity of places that make up Palestine doesn't have to be seen as an impediment to recognizing connections across those places. It's been because of policies of separation and distinction that Gaza and the West Bank seem as separate identities as well as spaces. But Palestine is made up of Gaza and Nablus and Ramallah and all of these places, and people can be connected to these localities as well as connected to broader communities. And if I can say just one other thing, just to adding back to what Bashara was importantly pointing to about the policies of ethnic cleansing and what this moment can bring, in addition to long-standing efforts to move people out of Gaza, Israeli policy has had long-standing efforts to reorganize the geography inside Gaza and to basically to end the refugee camps as spaces of living and spaces of identification for people. And they've pursued different mechanisms for that over the years, including the language of development, including the language of security, and of course the destruction that's happening now is beyond anything we've seen. But it is notable that the repeated targeting of refugee camps as for destruction is that too needs to be placed within a longer trajectory of policies that are interested in ending the existence of refugee camps as spaces that can organize Palestinian politics and Palestinian identity.
Before we move on, and let me actually switch this. Before we move on, I'd like to bring into this discussion Giulia Marini, who is one of the two remarkable speakers from
Could
the.
I just, if I could I just also respond, or rather add to what Ilana said
Yes,
in response to
absolutely.
that
I
question?
just want to bring in Julia so she can be part of the conversation and continues to address this, and then we can move to the discussion on the third teach-in on human rights and the war in Palestine. One moment. And as I find the feed, I'm going to share that Julia actually works with Al Mizan Center for Human Rights in Gaza. And here we go. Hi, Julia.
Hi.
We can't hear you. Hello. Okay, let me bring you. You have two screens. I'm gonna bring you in twice. Maybe the
The
second
more
one.
the merrier. Ah, there we go.
There we
I
go.
heard that. I heard that
We
chuckle.
heard that.
Oh,
Can,
can you hear
can
me now?
yes, we can hear you now. I just don't know which one it
Kill the
is.
first feed. It was the second feed that brought in her
Okay,
audio.
so you are in twice. So okay, can you try to say something?
Does he
There's an
work?
echo.
Perfect. Okay,
Perfect.
so Julia, we will come back to you right after Mu'in addresses the earlier question, and we also would like to hear from you your thoughts on Gaza before we move to the actual teaching.
Well, I just wanted to say, further to the point Ilana made about trying to restructure the geography within the Gaza Strip. I mean, you've had this phenomenon of housing projects, perhaps the best known of which is Sheikh Radwan in Gaza City. And these were actually established by Israel in the 70s and the 80s formally to address the issue of overcrowding in refugee camps. But the way it worked is refugees from the refugee camps could build houses in these housing projects and move there, but on the explicit condition that when they moved, they would demolish their homes within the refugee camps. So this, I think, just add some detail to the point you made. But regarding to the question, I think it's also important to recognize, as Bashara was saying earlier, the Gaza Strip was not annexed by Egypt. It was administered by Egypt as an inseparable part of Palestine. And what that meant is that the Palestinian identity, in contrast to the West Bank and Jordan, was never suppressed in the Gaza Strip. And in fact, it was encouraged and promoted by the Egyptian authorities. And I remember speaking to people in the West Bank who said, after 67, when we first came into contact for the first time in 20 years with people from the Gaza Strip, we were taken aback at how openly and proudly they expressed their Palestinian identity, because we lived in a situation where we were more or less kind of under a formal obligation to present ourselves as Jordanians rather than Palestinians. And there have also been, kinds of various attempts to undermine a Palestinian narrative. I would argue that Palestinian identity has historically been strongest in the Gaza Strip compared to many of these other geographies. And but that notwithstanding, I think every Palestinian community always also has its distinct characteristics. And I think what Gazan Palestinians have always been known for is their extraordinary resourcefulness. I mean, these are people who started running cars on cooking oil during the blockade. You know, they said Gaza City started smelling like a falafel store at a certain point because cars and taxis were using cooking oil because gasoline was not available. I mean, if you look at what happened on October 7th, they were using paragliders and kind of drone, you know, commercial drones that you would buy at a department store for your kids at Christmas, to breach the barriers that Israel had constructed for well over $1 billion to encage the Gaza Strip. I mean, as Sven, I forget his name, the recently departed EU representative to the Gaza Strip said after taking a paragliding trip there, in Gaza, anything is possible.
Thank you, Moeen. I know, Bshara, you have to address this, but let me quickly turn to Julia on this very question, or any comments related to what you have heard. Before we get to the teach-in, we will get to the teach-in formally right after we potentially release our hostages after this question. So it's all you, Julia.
I mean, I joined the conversation just a few minutes ago, but what from I heard, I mean, I can just confirm everything that has been said. I've never met people like the Palestinians, and I never met Palestinians in Gaza. Just a few days ago, I was discussing with some of my colleagues, you know, at some point they might be forced to decide between, you know, stay there and be killed by Israel genocidal warfare, or, you know, forced to be ethnically cleansed and leave Gaza and be forced to move into Egypt. And one of my colleagues told me that, you know, he was already made refugee once in 1948, and that if he's gonna die, he's gonna die in Palestine as a Palestinian. And I think that this encapsulates the resilience of the people in Gaza.
Thank you, Julia. Bshara, any thoughts on the question, or any sort of last thoughts? Sorry, we cannot hear you.
No, just very briefly that this is a quickly moving situation. Every day brings new surprises. At the same time, the scale is such that you feel it's a very new kind of situation. I think if this lasts much longer, it'll be right up there with 48 and 1967 as one of the seminal moments in this long history. And in its wake, I think there'll be a reframing of our understanding of the entire quote unquote conflict, which is a word I try not to use, with brand new political horizons, I think. And it's very revealing to listen and see these young people lead the demonstrations and the struggles that we see today. This is not older folks who are out there on the street and who are the main engine, but younger ones. And I think we have to listen carefully to what they're saying to know which way the winds are headed in terms of how the Palestinians pick up the pieces and move forward.
Thank you. Before we let you go, Ilana and Bshara, if there's anything else you'd like to share, that would be great. Otherwise, we really would love to speak with you. Hopefully not too soon, because that would mean that this is continuing. The killing and the devastation is. So, do you have any last words, Ilana? You good? Tayyip, thank you so much again for joining us. We both really appreciate. Where are we? We're not even in this. Do we even exist if we're not online? Okay. We're both very appreciative of your time, and we will now move to Julia. Salam, Bshara, and Ilana. Thank you so much.
Bye.
So, Julia, as Bassem has already mentioned, but to remind our viewers, you were featured in a teach-in about human rights, along with Omar Shakir from Human Rights Watch. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of it's, every day there's a new human rights violation. But before we get into today, can you recap for our audience a little bit what was covered in that teach-in?
Sure. I would say that the teaching was sort of threefolded. So we tried to highlight what's the current situation in Gaza now, and specifically what are the human rights violations that are occurring there on a daily basis. Of course, we did it while try to bring in mind that everything that is happening right now in Gaza fits within a wider context, specifically a context of colonization, a context of apartheid, and a context of military occupation, with the ensuing legal regime that arise in such context. And lastly, in the hope that there is going to be a ceasefire soon, we also address the issue of justice and accountability, because of course, international law not only provides rules, but it also provides sets of responsibility for both states and individuals that violate those rules. So we try to highlight what are going to be the foreseeable avenue that Palestinians can pursue to achieve some sort of justice for what's happening in Gaza, again, right now, but also for what's been happening to the Palestinian people for the past 75 years.
Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive recap. And it will be included. A link to that teach-in will be included in the digest for this show, which will be published in the coming week. That said, Julia, can you provide us with some updates as to the status of human rights and whether or not they're being upheld right now, today specifically, as Israeli forces are surrounding Gaza's largest hospital?
Yeah, I mean, I think that our attention today should be exactly on what you just mentioned. So the besieged hospitals in Gaza, and especially Al Shifa and Al Quds Hospital in Gaza City. I mean, we've been saying for weeks that these hospitals might be collapsing any day now, and the day is today. This will have and has catastrophic consequences on the right to health and the right to life of thousands of Palestinians, especially since the number of people that were injured over the past 36 days, it's around 27,000 people. Many of whom will probably face lifelong consequences from those injuries because they were not being able to properly to be treated properly. There is also this silent crisis of people that used to receive daily care and regular medical follow-up before the 7th of October, that again for the past 36 days have essentially been unable to receive proper medical care. So there have been reports of some, cancer patients that have passed away because of the impossibility of accessing medical treatment. So I guess that like today there is a clear violation of the right to health. There has been some response, I would say, from certain UN agencies. So we have seen many appeals from the WHO, from humanitarian organization, and a very, very strong standing from the special rapporteur on the right to health. But it seems that so far our calls for a stop and a ceasefire are still unheard.
Thank you, Julia. And it was really an eye-opening teach-in and presentation that you provided along with Omar Shakir, who is not able to be with us today. Let me ask Mu'in if he would like to be in conversation with Julia about specifically about the human rights and the devastation that we are witnessing in Gaza. You are muted, but I can read your. I personally can read your lips. I know what you're gonna say. Hold on a second. Maybe you're not muted.
Oh, we never brought him out of the green room.
Oh, are you in? Nope.
No.
Still.
Excuse us, Julia. I know this is your first time on the show. We have some technical difficulties sometimes.
Let's see what we can do here.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
sir.
Right. Well, I don't really have much to say on the human rights situation. I think that was very very well explained and very much detail first in the podcast and now just now by Julia. What I will say is I think it's important to focus not only on the violations themselves, but on those who are responsible for holding perpetrators to account. And in this specific case, I think the role, for example, of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, along with some other of these characters, have been playing an absolutely shameful, perhaps shameless, is a better description, role. I mean, if you look at the statements of Karim Khan, who I've taken to calling Karim pro Genghis Khan, he's been dragging his feet on Palestine as a quite deliberate political strategy from the moment he was appointed. And he's made very clear in his latest statement that he considers it his responsibility to prosecute Palestinians, Hamas commanders and leaders and so on, while leaving dealing with Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity and potentially genocide, leaving that to what everyone knows is a thoroughly discredited Israeli judiciary. He's had a clear agenda from the very outset of giving Israel a free pass and ensuring that Israel retains its U.S. enabled impunity in its dealings with the Palestinian people. Similarly, Volker Turk, who's but a shadow of his predecessors, has has been talking about humanitarian ceasefire and the need for humanitarian aid to enter the Gaza Strip and so on. That's all important, but he's not the head of the UN OCHA. You know, he is the High Commissioner for Refugees, and what he should be talking about 24 hours a day is the violations of human rights in this region, remedies, and accountability. And he's simply failing at his job. Similarly, you take the Secretary General of the United Nations. He has lost more staff members in this conflict in the space of 1 month than in any other conflict in the history of the United Nations. And all he can do is mourn them. He hasn't called for investigations of their killing. He hasn't called for accountability for these staff members who have been killed. Again, those who are most responsible for seeking accountability for these human rights violations have, in my view, been the absolutely most shameless characters in this entire crisis.
Thank you, Maureen. And Julia, are there, we keep asking this question, and we actually did ask it during the actual teach-in. Is there anything legally binding that human rights organizations can bring to bear, or is this simply a matter of might makes right, and the human rights organizations can simply caution and issue condemnations and so on? Is this? I mean, this is the understanding. Is it correct or is it incorrect?
Well, Essentially, yes. What we do, well, we have some mechanism in place, as it was mentioned. The ICC is one of them. We also have a commission of inquiry. There is a pending case at at the International Court of Justice regarding the illegality of the occupation itself, which is different, but it's still a form of accountability somehow. But those mechanisms are not really taught for NGOs, right? So we can put some pressure, we can issue statements, we can address them, we can work with them, but at the end of the day, that's where our work ends. At the end, the decision is there to take, right? Of course, we can try to push the ICC prosecutor to issue arrest warrant, but at the end, the decision it's on him. However, what Al-Mizan and other Palestinian groups have been doing is to, help connecting victims, for instance, with this accountability mechanism. And in some cases, we have also, you know, tried to pursue some universal jurisdiction cases around the world in various states, including the United Kingdom, Germany, Spain, all of which unfortunately failed. And I think we can safely say that the reason why those cases failed is not because the law was not there. There was a lack of political willing to pursue those cases.
Maureen, any
No,
razor point?
well, I would just say one thing this crisis has revealed is the absolute sham of the so-called rules-based international order, which is, that you mobilize international law and you mobilize accountability for war crimes and all the rest of it when you're dealing with enemies and adversaries. But when it comes to friends and allies, then it's impunity. Then it's you give them weapons, knowing that they are killing thousands of children and bombing hospitals and ethnically cleansing territory and bombing refugee columns and all the rest of it. I have to say, as far as any accountability for any Israeli crime coming from either the international system or Western governments, I judge the possibility of this happening at literally zero. I've said, the only people who are capable or who will be able to hold Israel and its war criminals responsible for their war crimes and crimes against humanity and potentially genocide are the Palestinians themselves and their real allies. Because international institutions and Western governments have made incontrovertibly clear that they either consider it their priority to support and enable these crimes or to ensure that Israel can commit them with impunity. And it really is, unfortunately, that simple.
Well, thank you both very much for your reflections there. Julia, we will, of course, have you back, especially as it appears we will not be seeing any, how do you even say it, any lightening up in the future with regards to human rights violations. So thank you, Julia, for joining us.
And Julia, we just want to also make sure that you're safe and sound, and then you continue to be so.
I am. I just hope that my colleagues will continue to stay safe and sound,
Yes,
as they are currently in Gaza as we speak.
Thank you very much, Julia,
Thank you
and
so much.
hope to speak with you soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Now, before we close out our episode today, we do want to, even though they happened in November, so that will be part of our November episode. This is our October recap episode. But there have been 2 more teach-ins that we haven't covered today, and we will have those guests featured on those teach-ins next month. However, do want to plug those for any interested parties. The first is a teach-in regarding geography, Gaza and geography. That is with Noor Juda and Jihad Abu Salim. This is a wonderful discussion. about the geography of Gaza, what makes it attractive to Israeli occupation forces, the history of settler colonialism within Gaza, as well as the border crossings and how they are controlled. It's a really enriching conversation, and highly encourage all of our viewers to check that out. The second teach-in that we've had in November so far was about the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. This has always been a timely discussion, but particularly so right now, as we've seen various campuses, chief among them Columbia University, suspending activity of the Jewish Voice for Peace, as well as the Students for Justice in Palestine chapters on their campus, with charges related to promoting anti-Semitic language, behavior, what have you. So this is an excellent conversation for all folks to tune into, especially those who are in the public space and who are encountering people who are accusing them of anti-Semitism, when in fact the critiques that are being made are those of an anti-Zionist nature.
And it's really important to take a look at this teaching, especially if you are active, and especially if you are in a relatively vulnerable position, such as students on campus who are often not aware of what it is that they could safely say. Things that have been said, regurgitated, and repeated everywhere ad nauseum for decades are now criminalized. So we are actually also working on a teaching that addresses people's rights, student rights, and we will be featuring students who are going to join us and share their experiences, backed up with video that shows what actually did happen during some of these demonstrations in which they were accused of being aggressive, when in reality they were simply trying to defend themselves against others who have, for instance, approached them with phones and cameras to their faces in a belligerent way. And if you so much as block that activity, just block it, not by being hostile, but simply try to hold up your hand against your own face in order to not have the cameras actually touch your face.
That sounds like anti-Semitism to me.
You are actually accused of being hostile, and this is what the police end up actually charging you for. Unfortunately, a lot of these students are, not unfortunately, but the reality is that a lot of these students are worried about being doxxed, worried about being
Evicted.
outed, criminalized further. So they will be joining us anonymously. But the videos actually will speak for what they will be sharing, because everybody was masked. Because today we live in a country and in a context that is completely unrecognizable for so many people interested and who care about anything that have to do with rights. And it seems that it will be the case for a while, not least after the New York Times article today addressing the banning of student groups, SJPs, Students for Justice in Palestine, and basically Jewish Voice for Peace. And that is, which is what MK already addressed. And that is actually quite scary, because it seems that this will be a trend, and it's very important for people to actually be active with their own administrations in the universities immediately, because once a decision has been made, it will probably not be reversed. And it is politics, so there is room for action, and there is room for voicing concerns and voicing opposition, because it will make a difference. In all cases, I hope that we will continue to provide via the Palestine in Context series, to continue to provide these teachings and these opportunities for to learn more, and also to come together with other like-minded people and organizations. Mu'in, do you have any words on the question of what is happening in the United States in this, at some point, beyond McCarthyist methods?
Well, it does seem pretty extraordinary that an explicitly Jewish peace and activist organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, is first of all being attacked and delegitimized by the Defamation League, and is then being banned under the pretext that its activities are, in so many words, because this is what's really being suggested, promoting anti-Semitism, which makes, I think, as clear as anything can, um, that anti-Zionism has hijacked anti-Semitism and has redefined it into a political shield for Israeli war crimes. And the real victims of this are going to be Jews who are victims of genuine anti Semitism, um, and Jews who are potentially going to be considered guilty by association through no fault of their own, through these crazy campaigns by the Defamation League and APAC and others that seeks to redefine Judaism as Zionism and anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. Thank you for your reflections there. Before we close out the show today, I do want to make space, Bassam, for you to talk about another podcast that
Mine,
Bassam does not sleep. That's, if anyone is watching and wondering, how is he doing all these
I do
things?
sleep.
Shwayan.
Shway. Mine is, if you can stay with us, even though we're gonna cover your face and camera
Sure.
with a
Censorship.
with a flyer, just to silence you. لحظة معلش.
But please talk about the War on Palestine
Yes,
podcast,
the
which
war-
is available on
which-
all streaming services that you might get your podcast from.
Absolutely. Well, the War on Palestine podcast is. Why can't I find the URL? Well, here we'll just run this. We'll just run this, which actually has the URL. The War in Palestine podcast is a podcast produced twice a week by Ziad Abu Rish and Noor Aliqat, and I'm hosting the podcast. It's an audio podcast which lives on Spotify, iTunes, as well as on SoundCloud, and you can find all of the or existing episodes on Palestine in context. By the way, I haven't looked at the camera all day because I'm really
Perfect.
pissed. Okay, so the Palestine in context.
From the top.
From the top, the War in Palestine podcast is available on PalestineInContext.org. The 4 episodes. We have another episodes coming up in the next 36 hours, and it basically chronicles what has been happening in Palestine in straightforward, newsy manner with some analysis towards the end, which tries to separate them to the extent possible and kind of catches you up if you are lost in the fog of in the barrage of news and analysis and texts and podcasts. It kind of pares things down to various dimensions of the war in Palestine, the war in Gaza, the assault on Gaza, and addresses the diplomatic battleground, humanitarian, geostrategic dimensions, as well as the legal dimensions, addressing the ICC, the UN, the United States, and so on. And it's been actually gaining traction. A lot of people depend on it because it actually sums things up in a concise manner. So please check it out. And I will now uncover Moin's face. Ahlan Moin. So did you just say boo? طيب, Mu'in, any last words before we leave in terms of what you, I mean, this is turning into like a news show, which is not what it is. It's actually a month of knowledge production at the Arab Studies Institute, but this is what we're producing knowledge about. So let's close with a final question to you, and that is, uh, I mean, I know nobody knows, but how long can this last, and what are the parameters with which we can judge or try to expect or predict or analyze how long this might last?
Well, as you said, it's a difficult question. I think what has been made clear in the past month is how utterly dependent Israel is on the United States, militarily, politically, and diplomatically. And we've also seen Washington playing an increasingly direct role in Israeli decision making. And so, therefore, I would say that this will go on as long as Washington determines it should continue. And if you kind of look at the Byzantine politics of Washington, you have someone like Biden, a Netanyahu Democrat, as he's recently been called, who simply doesn't care and wants this to continue. Then you have someone like Secretary of State Blinken, who is so absolutely clueless about the Middle East that, as I believe it was Bishara was mentioning earlier, went to the Middle East on his first trip, genuinely believing that he could persuade Arab states to support the Israeli American proposal for the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. These are people, people like Biden and Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk, people who are incapable of distinguishing between Israeli and American interests. It's not that they place Israeli interests ahead of American ones, they see them as one and the same. And then you have others, I think, probably people more associated with the Pentagon, the intelligence services. You now have Burns in the region who do see a distinction between Israeli and American interests and are seeing the very real risks to U.S. Influence and potentially interests in the Middle East, and who are perhaps taking a position that, if the Israeli military is not capable of more than mass killings and mass murders and is unable to achieve meaningful military objectives, that perhaps the clock should start winding down, which is a long way of telling you I don't think there is a clear answer at this point in response to your question.
طب لشو جايبينك انه if you can't
I
answer this
didn't ask
very
to come on.
شو?
I didn't ask to come on. You invited me.
No, I mean, okay. All right, there we go. So, طيب, شكرا كتير. Thank you so much, Mu'in.
I expect, unfortunately, at least another week or two, and I would also expect things to continue to get significantly worse by the day.
And as I was sharing with someone,
Okay.
just in case they don't want to be, it seems that as we move forward, the intensity is increasing, not just as a function of the barbarity and just sheer violence of the perpetrator, but also because Israel realizes the window is closing and it needs to clear things out before a more extensive or successful ground invasion. Do you agree with that assessment?
I agree with that in part. I think the other factor here, and I think this is something that Biden doesn't care about, Blinken has no clue about, but people like Burns and perhaps Secretary of Defense Austin are very much aware of, is that the longer this goes on, the greater the likelihood of a more regional war, one that has a potential to draw the United States in directly, also in an election year, which is a not insignificant factor. So I think that's another dynamic that's making the clock ticking, that you have some people who want to put certain measures in place to seek to avoid regional war. I think there are others, probably more in Israel than in the United States, who are perhaps eager for regional war because they hope it will be fought by the United States on Israel's behalf rather than directly by Israel.
All right. Well, if you can just hold on 1 second because we forgot to do the interlude. We'll just do a 5 second interlude and then we will close.
I'm sure the people really missed that.
I'm sure. All right. Shukran Mu'in. Thank you so much for being
Thank
with us.
you.
And please
Great to
join
be with
us
you.
in the future again. We really appreciate your insights.
Always a pleasure, Bassam and MK.
Good to see you.
Bye.
And with that, that is a wrap on Live with ASI, A Month of Knowledge Production, Season 4, Episode 3. We will be back next month. As Bassam noted, things were a little bit different today. They were less of a recap and more of an ongoing conversation, but that's just the nature of the moment that we're in.
Essentially, this is the knowledge we have produced, if we are sticking to the title, for the most part, on Gaza and context. There were a few other pieces that were published that we could talk about, but I'm assuming that there is a chance for us to recap some of these in the next segment, which is in a few weeks, and it will also feature the other teach-ins that were not featured today because they were held in November, and also because people couldn't make it on short notice. The last one was yesterday. So thank you all very much. I hope that everybody is able to continue to stay safe and stay vigilant and
take care of yourselves, take care of others,
and speak up. We need to speak up. Yeah, your message is also very important. I'm just also interested in people speaking up and being courageous because this is the time for it. طيب. Salam.